All right. Greetings, everyone. I'm Zuhairi, who is the main OC for Curtin into School Debating Competition 2026. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your participation and joining this debate judge workshop. So in this workshop, we're basically going to go through some basic understanding and principle in terms of how judging works for CIDC 2026, as well as I'm going to briefly inform how the system is going to look like and how is it going to be like, how ballots are going to be filled in. So if there's any question, you are free to type in chat at any time and I'll answer the question as best I can. So without further ado, let's begin. Okay, so when it comes towards a basic introduction towards judging, is that one thing that we have to keep note is that debates are not won purely by considering who is right and or wrong, but through the art of persuasion by proving burdens within the constraints set by the motion, which means in every motion, there's always a specific goals that teams always drive to cater towards to, and that's those how both teams persuaded on how they are able to achieve those goals are then how the debates are being determined who wins this, who loses. So therefore, the question is, the judge are the main people in charge of assessing how persuasiveness are the speeches given by the teams following a consensual metric of debate. So the metric in this context basically means the criteria that judges basically uses in order to judge any debates. So one thing that's very important in almost every debate competition is the fact that like all personal biases and views of the subject should never be ever taken into account when judging this debate because it's unfair for the participants, which means even if you are an expert in certain like fields or and etc., and the motion is luckily is like the same as what you are expert in, ensure what you listen and how you evaluate all of this, like all the analysis provided by teams, are based on what teams already provided and not really inserting what the general knowledge that you have in order to basically like judge the debate as a whole. Okay, so in this competition, we have three tiers of levels of judges. The first one is basically trainee. So trainee is basically those who are new to judging and do not have any debating experience. The main difference between trainee, panelist, and chair are basically that like for any trainees, they don't have any ballots that they can submit to the debate. However, they are encouraged to basically give their own, I would say, try to contribute towards the overall discussion of debate with the other panelists and judges in order for them to be evaluated. So the way how training is being like done is usually that like those who are inexperienced, they will have labeled trainee in the tab system. So once they feel like the core jury panel feel that they are competent enough to basically become an actual judge with ballots, then they're able to be promoted to panelists, which begs to the question of panelists. So in early on, panelists have some experience and a good understanding of how to judge a debate, which means they will have a ballot in terms of submitting and giving speaker score towards the individual who are involved in the debate. And lastly is chair. Chair is usually being given to the most who are very experienced and have a very strong understanding of judging. So what chair usually do for like competitions like Asian parliamentary is that they facilitate the deliberation among all judges, which means you have to ask other judges regarding towards the questions of like how the debate is being seen, the metric that like all judges like would want to discuss about, and then like the speaker score that like all judges are considered to be given. It's very normal for like chair to be in the minority or like in the majority, and it is very low for there's a split to happen. However, the main point is the fact that like chair is basically the one that's helping the discussion to happen to ensure the deliberation is being done by like within 10 minutes of the debate. So a judge can be either promoted or demoted during the competition, depending on the judge's feedback from the participants while abiding by cap discretion of the individual, which means we will heavily monitor the feedback given by the participants as well as the other judges who are judging with you in order to determine whether we're going to demote you or promote you in like all of this, either of these three levels throughout the competition. So depending on how well you do in terms of your judge score, that's how we determine your placement in rooms, as well as like the level of judges that you are eligible to be with the cap discretion, who are the three adjudicate panel of this debate. Right. So moving on to a very core principle of judging, which is an average reasonable voter. So there are four criteria that we have to consider when it comes towards like being an average reasonable voter. The first one is basically having sufficient general knowledge, which means a person that has a sufficient amount of knowledge that is brought on the subject at hand rather than considered to be an expert, which basically means at some to a certain extent, you are able to know the general things that's happening. For example, like status quo, how does like the Malaysian constitution basically like fundamentally looks like and etc. Those are basically sufficient general knowledge that we are looking for as an average reasonable voter. Secondly, is clear of individual biases and view on the subject matter. Therefore, an individual that does not have a preset view on the matter of the debate, and judges should always be open-minded and willing to be convinced by teams that provided a reasonable case. So even if like teams give out things that are somewhat weird, however, if it's like reasonable towards the paradigm of the debate and the metric of debate, then judges should be open-minded to be persuaded by what teams provided within their analysis. Thirdly, able to logically analyze the debate. So what this basically means, when a debate happens, it could either be messy, too hectic, or just too many like complex concepts that are being thrown in here and there. Therefore, it's the judge's responsibility to able to logically track the debate that involve all of these kind of things that is being explained by teams. So teams can freely bring in materials that are deep so long as they can explain the logic and relevance of those materials to the subject. So it is important for teams to explain the analysis so that an ordinary intelligent voter can understand. So I think a good way in terms of like giving like an example or like a parallel to show how does it look like is when during election times. So it's quite often where we see politicians during election, especially manifesto, where they brought up all of these statistics saying they're gonna do like certain changes, etc. And therefore they're able to explain or persuade people to vote for them. So how it works for like this particular like part of the average reasonable voter is basically similar to that, where if you are able to understand what are the manifestos given by this politician, then it's easy for you to vote for them and basically justify why would you want to vote for them in the first place. And lastly, are basically like the aim of like every judge is basically to evaluate the persuasiveness, which is the main emphasis as to why and the responsibility of a judge. So judges should focus on the persuasiveness of the analysis provided by teams rather than the manner of the intelligence. So what this basically looks like, let's say a team is very funny and know how to give like a very good public speaking way of in terms of manner. In debates, we don't really look more into that because we don't see how that's gonna like be the main thing as to why a certain team would win. We always try to look into how persuasiveness, which is like a combination of like manner and how the content is being provided by teams, which ultimately leads to why that team is being persuasive. Okay, so and then we move on towards the persuasiveness. So persuasiveness in debate can be determined by showing reasonable justification for the truth and importance of the claims made by teams. A few things that you can try to ask yourself are four things. Number one, are teams logically consistent when trying to support their claims? Which means whether or not teams are able to be being consistent in terms of like trying to show what they're trying to prove is ultimately logic and reasonable. Secondly, how accurate is the truth explained by teams? So what this basically looks like goes back to how the general knowledge that a judge should have is basically that like when Malaysia is basically a democratic country, but then teens suddenly brought up Malaysia becoming an autocratic country, that means like the truth, how accurate the truth is, always goes towards like teens who are the most accurate towards the analysis provided. Thirdly, how clear are the reasons for the claims that is being provided by teams? So if teams are able to provide like enough and sufficient analysis to basically back up all their claims, then usually that team is going to be more persuasive. And lastly, are the claims relevant to debate? This is like happens more than you actually think because like sometimes teams can easily like go fly away in terms of like, doing like things that are not relevant to debate. Therefore, like it's the judge's responsibility to basically determine whether the claims are true and a claim are relevant or not to this debate, which leads to like how persuasive the teams are. So manner and analysis are not really separate things when it comes towards like assessing arguments. Like it does not count as persuasive when someone is funny and confident, even if the speech lacks logical justification for the argument. And it's similarly for arguments that cannot be understood by the judges are not persuasive. So despite the reasons being brought up, which basically means manner and analysis are both things are always things that are being assessed at the same time whenever you wanted to determine persuasiveness. If someone manages to bring up a good point but doesn't really know how to present it, that is not considered persuasive. On the other hand, if someone is able to bring up a very interesting way of in terms of presenting, but then the analysis provided is not really relevant to debate, then it doesn't really count as persuasiveness. So one thing to heavily emphasize for persuasiveness is the fact that like statistics and numbers does not really equate to persuasiveness, which basically means even if teams bring up a lot of like references from like Oxford, scholars from like professors from Oxford, or like statistics number from any of like economy and etc., it usually doesn't really count as like persuasiveness. Instead, in most cases, especially in online competition, people would always flag it as like AI generated arguments, which usually a red flag for like arguments that are provided by teams. So to teams that provided any statistics or number, try not to credit them until you already understand and see whether or not what they're trying to claim on have the relevant information to back up the claim as well as the analysis in order to prove why their claim is ultimately true by the end of the day. All right. So on this part is mostly on how to judge. So first is like what a judge should always do. Does type does as type or does not? If you're asking whether you want to ask a question, you may type in the chat and I'll answer your question.
I mean, as in the statistics earlier, I thought you mentioned does not equate, but your slides does equate.
Oh, okay.
It
So
does
okay,
not.
yeah, that's an error. So I'll try to fix it and I'll try to send it back. So thank you for the yeah. Okay. So okay, before I continue, so far, is there any questions? 3, 2. All right. So how to judge? Basically, once you enter the room and you already sit on the judge, like I would say, placement, how do you actually started to judge the debate? So the first important thing is basically you tracking the flow of the debate, which means you track everything the speaker gave from first speaker to the last speaker of opposition to the both reply speeches by gave comprehensively in a manner that you are able to analyze the speeches accurately. So it doesn't mean you have to write down everything the speaker said, but you have to try to write down comprehensively about things that you are considering important and what you actually try to highlight in whenever you try to judge the debate as a whole. So always try to track arguments, rebuttals, and POIs and assess how developed are the materials are being given in order to basically justify the win and whenever like you wanted to go towards the discussion part. Because like after every debate ends, which is like the last speaker speaking, government reply, these participants will go out of the room waiting for the verdict. During that time, all judges within the room, including the trainee, will try to do a discussion of trying to determine who is basically more persuasive and who ultimately wins the debate by discussing what actually happens in debate. So this is where it's actually important for you to track the flow of debate and try to basically highlight things that you wanted to bring up during the discussion, which you felt that why a certain team ultimately wins the debate. Secondly, is avoiding self-insertions. Self-insertion is something that like what you try to provide your own personal biases and trying to basically like fill in the gaps that team doesn't really have within their arguments. So it is really, really not encouraged for you to do so because of the fact that like it leads to unfairness towards the other teams who are debating and trying to like create their own like gaps, their own like logical links throughout the debate. So never step into the debate by helping teams fill in missing gaps and links in their argument. Always, always, always analyze the debate objectively by observing whether the claims are proven true or sufficiently explained by the debaters. So it is usually the debater's responsibility to basically explain and fill in those logical gaps. The judge is only there to basically like observe and assess whether or not like is there something missing or whether those logical links provided by teams are actually true or false. Then lastly is able to construct key conclusion. So after each speaker ends, usually or like sometimes there's always gonna be an awkward time of like the speaker trying to finish up writing his or her like speech and try to give composure or something, the waiting time of like each speaker. Therefore, it's preferable during this waiting time where you try to construct key conclusions based on the analysis and arguments provided by teams. That way, it will like easier for you to discuss during the discussion, as well as like know that like what are the main thing that this particular speaker trying to talk about, which is ultimately easier if you want to compare the speeches given by like both teams. So understand the key phrases and conclusion that teams are trying to achieve, and judges must not automatically dismiss arguments because it is. Instead, you try to look into how it is able to impact the debate as a whole, which ultimately like helps a lot in terms of the judging process and the discussion part after the debate ends. Right. So clashes. So clashes is mainly just a fancy term that we use in the debating circuit. So in other words, clashes are usually the main thing what on how people usually try to judge the debate. Like if there are people that actually does debating, it's actually similar to how a weak speaker does, in which that like you try to compare what arguments and analysis provided by your team and your opponent. And the main simple term that we usually use is called clashes. So to further explain what this clashes is basically that questions or statement they are in disagreement and are considered impactful in the debate. So it is something that is included in almost every argument, and they are usually very obvious to spot early on. So, like for example, long term versus short term, government talks more regarding towards a long term of the benefits of certain things, while opposition talks more on the short-term harms of like certain things. So by that point, you could see there's two clashes happening, which is long-term versus short-term. So in debates, it's very like common to see multiple clashes happening. Therefore, it's the judge's responsibility to compare and determine who wins each of the clash and wins the important clash. So, ways on how you are able to evaluate them are on three things. Firstly, evaluate and compare the analysis raised by teams, which is like after they give up their arguments, how do they back up those arguments and claims? Those are things that should be compared and evaluate. Secondly, which issues are more important to compare towards the others? So in debates, teams will always try to throw in a lot of issues and saying that they are considered to be more important. Therefore, like it's the judge's responsibility to basically try to determine which issue is the most important one, and ultimately, that's usually the clash that's being used to just the debate as a whole. Thirdly, the approach on teams on how they're able to solve the issue at hand. So, one thing to take note: whenever there's an issue, that is being raised by both teams or any teams in the debate, it's always encouraged for them to provide a solution to the debate. If no, it will be something that we call a negative case, which means you only raise an issue, but then you don't really provide any sort of solution in order to solve it. In most of the common time, teams were able to explain clearly and realistically how they're able to solve their respective issues, especially the important issue, ultimately wins the debate and the clash as a whole. So it is important that judges highlight specifically what clash counts as the winning clash based on the criteria both teams agreed or things that are important to the debate. Yeah, so here are a few examples on the motion. This helps to get the narrative that hard work will lead to financial success. So in this debate, there's two different clashes that's being like determined for a judge that they can see. The first one is how is success being defined in debate. Government sides say being able to achieve things that a normal person is unable to achieve, like being a millionaire. Well, meanwhile, the opposition side, it depends on individual circumstances and their own definition of success, like getting out of poverty or having a stable income. So, on the first clash, in order to evaluate which sides are able to win this particular clash, judges will always try to look into which side is more likely to happen and which side is more like closely related towards the definition of success for debate. Therefore, like in this case, probably that government wins this clash of their definition, mainly because they're able to tell the judges clearly through their analysis over the fact that like billionaire is something like people usually use as like a criteria to determine whether the person are being like are successful or not. Which is why like people in status quo usually all praises like people like Jeff Bezos and etc. for them being a billionaire because they see those people are considered to be successful and those are usually the criteria if you want to be successful. Secondly, does the narrative benefits the society? On government side, it does not because it pushes an unnecessary burden towards the individual, leads them to be mentally distraught, and creates a toxic and materialistic society. Meanwhile, the opposition side pushes more on innovation and competition within society, and ultimately good in terms of building a strong society and nation. So, for this particular clash, one way that you can try to look into are two things. Number one, how realistic it is on these two benefits that is provided by both teams. And secondly, what are the scale of the impact that is provided by both of the teams. Opposition pushes more on like more innovation will happen, which ultimately leads to better growth of the nation, while government side is pushing more towards how realistic it is and how bad the situation will be in if like the narrative were to be accepted by the end of the day and it's not being regretted. So these are all basically like examples in terms of like how to see clashes. So yeah, right. So burdens. So burdens are usually objectives on what teams are usually try to assert in the debate. So team burdens are not something that can be created by assertion. Judges should not automatically accept them unless they are backed by analysis. Therefore, teams and judges must not push burdens that are considered unfair towards the opponent. So, teams that fail to meet the burdens do not ultimately lose the debate. Therefore, judges should always consider that the analysis brought up by the teams, even if they do not meet the burden. So, burden can give from motion of the debate. For example, this helps prioritize the vaccination of law-abiding citizens in the case of major epidemics. Governor's burden for this particular motion is to prove why law-abiding citizens should be the priority for vaccination when a major epidemic occurs. And then like as for like analysis by teams that can be set by burdens for the debate is, for example, this house believed that assassination is a legitimate tool of foreign policy. So one way in terms of like opposition can argue over the fact that like assassination is a severe breach of international law. Therefore, to make this argument relevant to debate, the opposition has the burden to prove how assassination is a legitimate form of foreign policy. So when it comes towards determining burdens in debate, it could be explicitly given by motions, especially when motion wants teams to compare one thing towards another, or motion that explicitly say like they wanted to do certain things. Therefore, like whether teams are able to see that burden is something that teams must do, and it's also the judges have to take note of whether teams are able to achieve that burdens in the first place. And moving towards like the analysis, I think in most cases, usually, if teams often repeat certain arguments or analysis, that usually means that's the burden that the teams would try to push for if they wanted to win the debate. Okay. So I think this part is mainly just those who are doing oral adjudication. In a scenario where A, you are the chair of the debate, or B, the chair is descending, therefore the panelists have to provide the OA, then followed by the chair. So how to give like an OA, which is oral adjudication, which usually being given after a verdict has been decided and teams are in the room. The first way is basically the general thoughts of the debate. So judges can provide both teams how the debate happens in general and the problem that it has. For example, was the debate engaging? Did teams manage to give a context clearly, or was the debate relevant in the first place? So all of these things are considered the general thoughts of debate. Basically, how does both teams are able to perform generally as a whole. Then secondly, we go by clashes, which are the things that are trying to be compared, come from both teams. So once a winner has been determined, the easiest way to justify it is to go through the clashes, highlight to the teams the clashes that were brought up, and which one is considered the most important. Afterwards, explain to teams how you comparatively weigh the clashes by giving sufficient explanation of what teams do and what do they lack and what they can do better to like compare towards their opponent. So when you try to justify why certain teams win on certain issues, it's usually through clashes. We try to say team A does things much more clearly compared towards team B, and that is why they ultimately lost the debate with a few like analysis to back up the justification and the call. Okay, now we move on towards I think the last two parts, which is the speaker scale for the competition. So in this competition, we don't really have a rubric in order to basically fill in like how like the Dato Wira competition is in terms of like manner, content, style, etc. Because like for this particular competition, we are more towards the holistical way in terms of judging. So here are the speaker scale that we're going to use for the competition, which are AP format. So from 68, from 67 to basically 68, it usually means the person doesn't really give much in terms of the analysis to back up their points and etc. 69 are usually that like teams does bring up certain analysis, but then doesn't really able to justify on why the analysis is a bit true and false. And from 70 to 73 it usually means like they are like so analysis are usually like sufficient and it's logical, but then there's still gaps that's kind of hindering them from getting like this the average score for the competition as a whole. So yeah, starting from 74 to 76, that's usually 74 to 77, that's usually the average in terms of like a decent and average like speech would actually look like. Which basically means arguments are basically like exclusive and relevant, frequently persuasive. However, occasionally like people like the debaters often doesn't really explain much in terms of like how is it like better compared towards the opponent. And from 79 to 83 is basically like the best speech that you ever heard of throughout the competition. So in terms of this, I will give you the slide and you can see each of the section in terms of like the speaker score. But then one thing to keep note, the maximum score for this competition is 80. which means even if it is the best debate that you ever heard, the maximum speaker score that you can give towards the debaters is only 80. Meanwhile, the lowest one will be around 69. Because like this is a high school tourney, therefore the level of judging is comprehensively different from the actual like Asian parliamentary format. So keep in mind with that. Right. Now we move on towards the last part, which is how the tabbing system works. So later on, we will be sending the we will be basically sending the private URLs to the emails being provided by teams. So later on, during the competition, there will be one section in the page where they say submit ballots. So once you click submit ballots, that section in your private URL, which is the link that we will provide it soon, you will see all of this like interface. Where the first part, you will see like the motion part. This part, the motion, are the motion that's being debated for the round itself. Meanwhile, the second part are the motions that's being vetoed by both of the teams, respectively. So one thing that you will have to do later on is to fill in the necessary information for this part, which is the motion, the veto, as well as like who is being first, second, third, and the reply speaker. So you don't really have to type anything because everything is under a slider box where you just have to pick and choose which one fits the correct one for the debate as a whole. So when you try to fill in the speaker scores and trying to determine who is the winner, it will be automatically from the ballots itself, in which that like as you can see on the numbers here, like 76, 75, 77, and 75, you just have to insert in the numbers for basically like that section of each individual speakers, and it will total up by itself because like that's just how the system basically works. So there's no need to use a calculator because like everything will be automatically generated. Even when you wanted to determine the winner, ensure that like the team that wins the highest, that has the highest score, is actually the winner, which will be highlighted further down with a green, yeah, with a green tag under the team itself. So yeah, that's basically it in terms of the how the tabbing system works. Right. So I think that's basically it in terms of the judging workshop. Is there any questions that anyone here wanted to ask? Any questions? As this section is right now is mainly just Q&A.
Maybe how many teams are we expecting?
Okay, question regarding towards the competition is also allowed. Okay, so later on, the amount of teams expected is 36 teams later on, which comprises of like teams from Perak, Miri, and Kuching. So that's the total and finalized like number of teams that we have right now. And the way how the competition will happen, for preliminary, senior and junior will go against each other, and only during the elimination round, which is from quarters to finals, where teams will be like separated into the respective category, which is senior and junior. Does that answer your question, Miss?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Is there any more questions? Any more questions? Calling once, calling twice. Good winning. Are there any specific criteria in a debater that we have to evaluate example, accuracy of data. Usually, in terms of what you try to evaluate, in terms of the criteria itself, is based on what I already said, which is the burdens of like each teams wanted to push, which is their main objective, as well as like how relevant what they're trying to debate about towards the motion. So if teams usually debate things that are not really irrelevant, then like it's something that you have to evaluate and try to see that like how you're going to justify that this team what they're trying to debate is not relevant. In terms of the accuracy of data, statistics usually we're not really encouraged to evaluate statistics because that's something that we cannot really evaluate because like even like in this world there's multiple statistics being used, therefore there's not really a correct one that can be used. So instead try to evaluate based on how accurate the analysis provided by teams towards like the facts that like the general knowledge that we know in like in status quo. So yeah, does that answer your questions? Right, you're welcome. Is there any more questions? Calling once, calling twice. Right, I'll stop the recording.